In previous videos, we set up and configured vCenter Update Manager. So what we're going to need to do now is create some baselines and baseline groups. Actually, we already have some baselines defined. We can see that I've got critical and non-critical host patches. So to get here, what I've done is from the home page, after I installed the plugin anyway for VUM, then you'll see that we have a section under the home page for solutions and applications, and we see Update Manager listed there. So we can see that we have baselines and groups. So baselines allow us to create collections of updates, and then baseline groups allow us to group those baselines together. And we'll take a look then at how we can associate them with hosts or clusters. So we've got two dynamic baselines, which means that rather than being an explicit list of specific patches, these are just grouped based on some kind of a property. And if we edit the baseline, in this case, it's based on host patches, and basically says, any vendor for any product that's marked critical is going to be part of this baseline. We could manually exclude some patches, and we could see that the default does already exclude some patches. And we could also manually include patches. And we can see we have another dynamic baseline that's similar, but the options that they're using are different. Basically everything that's not critical. But we can even do specific time periods here, specific vendors. When we get into add-on modules and things like Cisco Nexus vSwitches and so on, we may have updates coming from those vendors as well through the VUM infrastructure. So in this case, I want to create a static baseline or a fixed baseline. I want to list the explicit patches that I've tested. These dynamic baselines are great, maybe for my development and test environments. They just send everything there, and then I can get an idea as to which patches may or may not cause me problems in the future. So I'm going to call this one, tested and approved updates. Now, those are going to be patches for hosts. They're not extensions, not new functionality, not new versions of VMware, and they're not virtual appliances, but we can do those types of upgrades as well here. Just say that I want to make it a fixed baseline, and then choose the explicit patches that I want. So in this case, I'll probably want to find something specifically for ESX 5.1. They don't actually list them as ESXi in here. They list them as embedded ESX. Let's take these updates here, Tools Light and a couple of ESX base updates. One's moderate, two are important. They're bug fixes as opposed to security, and they require reboots. So that's something we're going to have to take into account. But that looks okay to me. I'm going to add those to my list. Now, in terms of the reboot, we don't want to do multiple reboots. And if this host is in a cluster, then we want to make sure that we integrate with the proper functionality of that cluster. So it can put hosts in maintenance mode and do all of those other sorts of tasks if we wanted to. Just go ahead and click Next. We can review it, and I can see the patches that I explicitly told it to include. I don't need to have any other kind of logic for it and so on. And then I can create baseline groups. So I may want to group these based on specific periods of time or something like that. If I have multiple baselines, rather than having to associate those directly with lots of different hosts and clusters, I may want to group the baselines once again, but I don't really need to do that. But baselines are groups of patches, and baseline groups are groups of baselines. So now that I've done all of that, what I really need to do is do some scans, some compliance checks against my hosts and or my clusters. So we'll see right now we're in the admin view of Update Manager, which is basically where we're going to configure Update Manager through here. And we've got, the option of view events and things like that. See the list of patches that are available. If you're going to do upgrades, then we can use ESXi images and we can import the new versions and use that to actually upgrade from 5.0 to 5.1 or to future versions or from older versions as well. So I'm going to move out of the admin view though and go over to the compliance view. Once I do that, we'll see what I'm actually in is the properties of my host and on the Update Manager tab. I could do this from a cluster as well. And if I was to do it from the cluster, then I would have additional options for how to remediate that cluster and so on. So what I really need to do though is attach a baseline. And then once I've attached the baseline and we know what we want to have applied to that host, then we can determine whether or not it's actually needed. And we can go ahead and remediate it if necessary. So I'm just going to click attach and we can see that my patch baselines are listed. I'm going to pick up tested and approved updates. You could also use a baseline group here if we like. I'll go ahead and attach that. We can see that this host is listed as unknown. We've attached the baseline, so we've associated these updates with it, but we haven't yet done a scan. So I'm going to go ahead and scan it. And in this case, I'm really just looking for patches. If we check our tasks, we can see that we've got a scan entity job running for that host. And you'll also see that there's some vCenter scheduled tasks that are created for the checking for new notifications and checking for updates and so on. But those happen independently of the scans, and you can just check the scheduled tasks in vCenter to see those. While the scan of the first host is running, then I'm going to go ahead and just attach it to the second host at the same time while we wait. And in case one of the hosts doesn't manage to finish its scan, we'll be able to see the results. So I'm going to go to the other host. I'm going to go to its Update Manager tab and do the same process. Now, if this was a cluster, then I wouldn't need to do these individually. Okay, we can see actually that our second host scanned much more quickly than the first one, which I expected was going to be the case. So I'm going to cancel the first host, and with all the different things I've been doing to it through the course of recording these videos, I'm not surprised that maybe certain parts are not working well anymore. So what we can see now is previously this host would have been listed as unknown, but you can see now that it's listed actually as compliant. So this host already has those updates. I think what I'll do is maybe go back and update the baseline, add another patch, and then see what we get. So let's switch back to the admin view, and I'm going to go over to my baselines, properties there. Try and use this search here. Oh, it's much better to find what we want. Embedded ESX 5.1, that's fine. I'll take this Cisco Nexus 1000 as well. Make sure that they're listed. So we've got 6 listed now, so that should be okay. So let's go ahead and scan that host again. Looks like I either don't need them or they're already replaced with something else. Let's take a look at the results. So if I click into the details, we can see that in some cases I already have these installed, or in other cases I don't need them because they're superseded by something else or by the version. And we can see in this case it's a new module, so that's a little bit different. Now I think in the case of the Cisco Nexus 1000 module, I may be able to install that even though it says this new module issues. So let's see what happens if we try to remediate this host. So if we stage, then what that's going to do is actually copy all the updates over to the host and have them available locally. So I'm just going to go ahead and directly remediate it. And we can see in this case that we can choose the baselines that we want to remediate once we've viewed the reports. And then I can just click next and see if there's any updates that actually are available for it. So we can see that it doesn't say that it needs any of them, so I don't have the options to do it. Otherwise, I would select them and we would be able to schedule the installation for that at a particular point in time. And when we look at the host remediation options, we can see if there's already virtual machines running on that host, we're going to need to deal with them. Now, in this case, this host is not part of a cluster. So really all that we're going to be able to do is shut down the virtual machines. So we can see whether or not we want to do that, or if we'd prefer to suspend them if your application's okay with that. However, we also have a couple of other options here. If we are part of a cluster and we're going to put this host in maintenance mode, then as part of maintenance mode, we're going to want to vacate the virtual machines from that host. In order to ensure that that can happen, some things that can affect vMotion are things like having connected removable devices that are, not on shared data stores. So we can say just turn those off, and we can also say to keep retrying to enter maintenance mode in case of a failure. Notice as well, there's also this option, enable patch remediation of powered on Pixie booted ESXi hosts. If you're using Enterprise Plus, instead of installing ESXi, we can actually Pixie boot every time the server starts and send a live installation of ESXi to those hosts. So if I have software updates that don't require a reboot, and I want to ensure that I'm not susceptible to whatever the problem is that that patch covers, and I don't want to force a reboot, then what I can actually do is just say to do it this way. Or what we may prefer to do is integrate it into the ESXi image that we're using with auto deploy and the host profiles and so on. Next time they boot, just pick up this already patched installation. So in this case, since we couldn't install any, I'm just going to go ahead, click next, but we'll see that really there's not much that it's going to actually be able to do for us. At this point, what would happen is that the patches would get installed. We'd actually see installation processes for them. If all goes well, then our host should get rebooted. However, if there's anything that interferes with that, we may have to intervene manually. So the best way to do this by far is to be using a cluster. And that all makes everything much, much easier to deal with. In this case, because there was no work to do, I didn't have my host restart. There was no issues or problems around that.